light to see if there's any weak or thin spots in the wax. You can tell if the wax is thinner in certain places by how much light shines through. So if there's any light shining through, that means it's too thin and it needs to be bulked up with the soft wax, which is the yellow wax you can see around the edges and in other places on the cast. So the next thing to do was to fill the wax cast with grog, and as you can see I've put metal pins in for support. Once this had set, they then need to be flipped and degreased using meths, as you can see in the photo. The next stage is to add wax runners and risers using a hot knife to melt the wax tubes onto the brick, and then adding soft wax where needed for extra support. Then the whole thing needs to be degreased and the next layer of grog painted on with a brush at first, and as soon as it starts to thicken up, you then start filling in the gaps with your hands, getting in and working it into all of the surface of the wax brick. So once you've done the first coat, it needs to be scored while it's still wet, and this helps the next layer of grog to bond. And once that had set, I then needed to add more runners and risers, attaching them again with hot knives and soft wax to the runners and risers sticking out, and then more grog needs to be layered over it for support. Again, applying with a brush while it's thin, and then getting in with the hands and working it in as it starts to thicken up. So eventually you end up with this kind of almost heart-shaped object. So the thick wax tubes are runners where the hot metal will be poured in, and the thinner tubes coming up are risers, which allows the excess metal and air to escape the mould.
So if you watch what I'm doing, and then you can take the other one.
Yep.
In fact, maybe you can take this one, because this one's a little easier. So holding it there, and then coaxing the grog up and around to keep it in position. Try to keep the whole thing as vertical as you can. Yeah? You've got a spare hand.
So once it was fully coated and stood up, this is what we had. It's a rather strange looking sculptural object. So the next step is to remove the protective layer of clay around the wax brick. So we put this in before we layered the grog on to keep the edge of the wax brick clean and grog free, so that we could attach more runners and risers at the next step. So this clip is just removing that excess clay, getting rid of it because we don't need it anymore, it's served its purpose. The next stage was to then add the runners at the top to allow the metal to flow through the mould and make sure we get all of that extra detail around the edges, and the two runners sticking out at the bottom to help carry away the excess metal and let the air escape from the mould. So the next step, once those were attached, was to degrease with meths again, which I've cut out of the video, and then to layer more grog into all of the gaps with a brush and then with my hands to completely cover the wax until it's completely coated in the grog. Again, making sure not to cover the runners and the risers too much with the grog, because we need to add more to those at the next step. So this is what it looks like once it's fully covered in grog. So none of the wax casts can be seen, just the runners and the risers sticking out.
One extend up a little bit. This one's a funny angle, so just cut it down and then join to there. Let me grab a couple more of those because it's easier to visualise if you can see the whole structure. Again, you know, use the same thickness. So take that up to about there. Trim that down to get a better angle. Yep, that can go to that. And that can go to that. Again, you could trim that, oh, I don't know, maybe just have that one as it is. So start with the same, start with the top three. We'll look at the others in a minute once we've got those joined up.
So at this stage you can see the 3 runners rising up to the top and the risers sticking out. This next stage shows the cup attached to the 3 main runners and 2 of the risers extending upwards. The next clip shows the 3 runners coming up to the top attached to the cup and all of the risers extending upwards attached to the top of the cup. The next stage was to make a plastic cylinder which was placed over the top of the mould and secured with a mixture of scrim and plaster around the bottom to stop it from leaking, and then around the middle of the moulds for extra support because they were quite large. Once this was all set and nice and sturdy, we then needed to pour second coat grog into the moulds, filling them right up to the top and then leaving them to set. These moulds were then covered to stop them from drying out and to keep them clean, and then they were ready to go in the kiln.